Hello and welcome to episode 73 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. This is your co-host, Sam Marvin, here with my other co-host, Sean Briggs. Sean, how you doing?
We've got stickers.
We've got stickers. We have our first piece of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things merch, although we're not going to sell them, right?
No, we're not going to sell them. If you feel so inclined and you've been with us for a while and you would like a little 2x2 square sticker, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook. You can send us a message on Facebook Messenger, and if you trust us with your mailing address, we will mail you a sticker if you are so inclined.
But if you're one of the dozens of bots that pepper our Facebook Messenger account all day long with phony messages,
daily,
you're not getting a sticker.
Oh my God. Yeah, if I see another... Your account will be deactivated in the next 24 hours if you do not click this link. I think
we're not clicking that link.
No, I think legit I have reported those as spam to Facebook probably like 15 times a day, roughly. Yeah, and I know you probably do some as well, and it's a lot.
It's terrible. But we're not here to talk about bots on Facebook. We are here to talk about House of the Dragon.
Yeah, we're starting a new kind of segment or topic that we're going to talk about season 1, since it's already come and gone. And we will hopefully coincide the end of our season 1 discussion with the beginning of season 2. And we will talk about those episodes as they are released. So exciting times here.
So before we jump into and today we're going to cover episode 1 and episode 2 of season 1. Before we jump in, Sean, did you watch House of the Dragon when it premiered?
I was delayed.
Okay.
I was not that interested in it when it was coming out. I think a huge part of that is probably the lackluster finale of Game of Thrones.
Lackluster is an understatement. That was an insulting finale. That entire final season and much of the seasons that preceded it were a letdown. There were some highlights, obviously, but it was kind of the air slowly coming out of the balloon. And I agree with you. I watched from the beginning, but I was not enthusiastic. And I think that the way that we approached it was similar to how a lot of other people approached it, where they had to be won over again. And I think we talked about it at the time, but House of the Dragon actually gained audience over the course of its first season, as opposed to the Rings of Power, which started big and then really, really lost a lot of people as the season wore on.
Yeah. So for me, I think I probably started watching it after episode like 4 or 5 came out. And then I finally had heard enough from people who said they enjoyed it that I went back to watch it. But for me, my thought process was just, why do I need this story?
Yeah. And
it was talking about Targaryens, and I was pretty much over Targaryens at this point. After Game of Thrones, I was like, I'm so tired of Khaleesi and her storyline and the Mad King and all of this bullshit. So then when that's what it was about, I was like, well, I'm not really intrigued. I will say that the first 2 episodes of the House of Dragon season 1, speaking very loosely until we can talk about like the summaries and get in depth, I think it drew me back in because it recaptured that early series Game of Thrones feel.
Yep, absolutely.
And if it feels like the Game of Thrones that I liked, then you're going to keep me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was able to do that throughout the entire first season. So I'm excited to talk about it. I have only watched each episode once, except for the 2 that we rewatched for today's episode that we're recording.
Okay. I'm in the same boat. This was my second time watching each of these episodes. Haven't touched the series since the premiere. Consumed a little bit of coverage, but yeah, this is my second full rewatch of each of these episodes. Okay, so we're gonna do a episode recap for each one and talk about it in turn. So let's kick it off with episode 1, The Heirs of the Dragon. With both his sons dead, old King Jaehaerys the First Targaryen convenes a great council to choose an heir. The Westerosi lords select Jaehaerys' eldest grandson, Prince Viserys, over Princess Rhaenys, the eldest grandchild. 9 years into his reign, King Viserys organizes a tournament to celebrate Queen Aemma Arryn's pregnancy, confident she is carrying his long-awaited male heir. Small council disregards Master of Ships Lord Corlys Valerian's warnings that the Triarchy, an alliance of Essos free cities, threatens to cripple Westerosi shipping lanes. Hand of the King, Sir Otto Hightower, criticizes Viserys' brother and heir, Prince Daemon, for his brutality as the City Watch commander. At the tournament, the young, handsome Sir Criston Cole, common-born knight, outcompetes Daemon. Meanwhile, Viserys sacrifices Aemma in childbirth, performing a C-section. Their newborn son, Balon, dies shortly after. Viserys refuses the council's pleas to appoint a new heir until Otto reveals that Daemon mockingly styled Balon as, quote, the heir for a day. Outraged, Viserys banishes Daemon from King's Landing and appoints his only living child, Princess Rhaenyra, heir to the Iron Throne, revealing to her Aegon the Conqueror's dream that inspired him to unify Westeros. That's the summary. What was left out? What was papered over in that summary, Sean?
Well, not much. I'll say to everybody, Sam is going to be the Sherpa of House of the Dragon, I think, for us, because I have never read any of the Game of Thrones books. I've only watched the Game of Thrones series, and I've watched season 1 of House of the Dragon. So I feel like you have a better grasp of the background than I do.
Yeah, that's true. I have to say I'm insulted because one of the very first Christmases I ever spent with your family, I gave you a copy of the Game of Thrones book, the first book, and A Song of Ice and Fire. And
I read the first half of it.
Oh, okay. That's good. Yeah.
His writing style it didn't, for me, a book has to like fucking get me. And if I'm got, then I'll read the whole thing. But whatever his writing style is, I just.
Really, that's interesting because he's given interviews about how he used to be, this is George R. Martin. He used to be, well, he still does write some for television, but one of his jobs before he wrote the Game of Thrones back in the, I think, late 80s, I think those seasons, there was a live action version of Beauty and the Beast. And that was his first big TV writing. And he took a lot of lessons from episodic writing and applied it to writing Game of Thrones. Like every chapter, it kind of ends on a little cliffhanger, and then you're eager to get back to it. And that's how these books kind of reel you in. I'm surprised that you weren't, like, the first chapter for me, the prologue for Game of Thrones with the White Walker confrontation, everything, that got me. But to each his own.
Yeah.
You don't need to rehash that.
Maybe I'll have to give it another go. We'll see. But so people have context. Sam will most likely be like our primary host, as we discuss House of the Dragon.
And I will say this, I have not read Fire and Blood, which is the book upon which the House of the Dragon is based. The good thing about House of the Dragon is that the material that it covers has been completely scripted out by George R. R. Martin. The history, the outcomes are known, at least according to kind of the metafiction that was the approach in Fire and Blood. So the idea is that Game of Thrones and its subsequent novels in the Song of Ice and Fire series are written from various points of view of the characters experiencing the story in real time. And they'll reference things that they heard, and there'll be stories that are involved, but it's all kind of their point of view. Whereas Fire and Blood is more of a meta history written by two different characters. I think one is Septon Eustace, who is like a learned priest, and then Mushroom, who was a court jester. And they have very conflicting. In some places their viewpoints conflict, and other places they align in kind of interesting ways. But each of them focuses on different aspects of what happened or what may have happened. Either way, House of the Dragon kind of charts its own path, which may or may not align perfectly with what is in Fire and Blood or what is in the Fire and Blood chapters, quote unquote, written by this Eustace and by Mushroom. So I'm not an expert, but I will be more than happy to weigh in and be the Sherpa, as you said.
That was a roundabout way to say you're not an expert.
Well, I wanted to establish that I know a little.
Okay.
I know something. I don't know everything.
Yes.
I know a bit.
So, episode 1. What made me feel like it had the Game of Thrones feel? The music, of course, very reminiscent of the Game of Thrones music. Just seeing like King's Landing, all of the like familiar buildings and architecture that you're reminded of in Game of Thrones. If violence is very pivotal to this House of the Dragon season 1, in particular the tournament that the king puts on for his unborn son who's about to be born. A lot of violence there, which reminds us of scenes with the Hound and the Mountain in Game of Thrones. If you have any trauma whatsoever around childbirth, you should skip this episode because I was unprepared for that C-section scene, and it was a lot.
We first watched that episode, obviously, when it came out, when Haley was a few months pregnant, and it was hard. And we did the rewatch together now with a almost 13-month-old child. And it was harder, I think, especially on Haley to watch that, having in the intervening times given birth.
Having gone through it, yeah.
Yeah, it is absolutely gruesome. And it's obviously foreshadowed pretty well, if not somewhat obviously, earlier when the Queen Emma is talking to her daughter Rhaenyra about how, you know, the knights have the tourney field, but the birthing bed is the battlefield for women. And that's just like one aspect of one of the major themes of this first episode, and honestly, you know, the entire series, which is the patriarchy and the roles of men and women in society, and how when people try to cut against those roles, there can be consequences. So we mentioned how there was a great council called of all the lords of Westeros, and they selected a son, the grandson of the king over the granddaughter of the king, despite the fact that she was not only older, but also she was the child of the king's older son. And so if you would kind of use the approach that the British monarchy takes, it's the oldest child regardless. I think there's a technical term for it, which is cognatic primogeniture. I think either agnatic or cognatic. I can't remember. It's been a while since I played Crusader Kings. But in this universe, men are the primary heirs, and that kind of sets up the big conflict of the series, and really the climax of this episode, which is when, after all the drama with Daemon, who is the king's brother, Rhaenyra, the king's daughter, is made heir. What else did you pull out of this episode as far as things that are being maybe set up for the rest of the things that you know are set up for the rest of the series, or things that you're looking forward to over the course of the season, etc.?
I like the conversation in Old Valyrian. I think the use of other languages is compelling for the story, especially when you have conversations between like the dragon keepers and the Targaryens, how they can communicate with each other, and basically all of the other houses in Westeros are just kind of in the dark as to what's going on. I think that was very intriguing. Mention of the crab feeder. I remember being very interested in that potential storyline in the first episode. And I know we'll talk about him in episode 2, because there's a little bit more plot development with that character in particular. I mean, otherwise, we don't really know a whole lot as to what the drama is going to be with this series as of episode 1, where it's just who is the heir apparent. And they kind of tell us at the end that it's Rhaenyra. So at this point, I'm still kind of waiting for I think we all are still waiting for what the big drama is going to be. And I don't think we really know it yet.
So there are a few things. I am looking back over my notes from my rewatch, and there's a few things here that they will become kind of major features and important ones. Primarily that Viserys is a weak king. And we get a hint of this with the small council meetings where he kind of ignores or downplays the triarchy and the shutting down of shipping lanes, which, it's a potential big conflict for his, trade is important to this society. It's important to the people on the small council, and he kind of ignores it and moves past it, doesn't want to deal with it. You can get a sense of how he can be headstrong, though. Just the whole idea of having a tournament to celebrate the birth of your son in a world where you have no idea what the gender is. And they talk about that in the show. And he's like, no, I had a dream, which ties back to this whole idea of Targaryens. Some of them have what are called dragon dreams, where they get glimpses of the future. And this is famously what prompted the Targaryens originally to leave Valyria before it was destroyed in a massive volcanic cataclysm. And then later in this episode, we get the reveal that it was a dream of Aegon Targaryen, that talking about kind of this great winter that blew out of the north and covered the world in darkness. Basically, the long night, the White Walkers that we're familiar with from the show and from the books. Aegon had a vision of this and saw that the way to stop this end of the world was to unite Westeros and have a Targaryen sitting as king. And that is actually something that George R. R. Martin has confirmed is now part of the Song of Ice and Fire canon, which does beg some questions about, why did what were the Targaryens doing in the 200 years, 300 years after that to prepare for the return of the White Walkers? But so that's something here with Viserys, kind of his characterization. He's both stubborn but also weak. Stubborn about certain things, but refuses to make decisions. I guess refusing to make a decision is being stubborn.
Isn't there a storyline kind of adjacent to him being wounded by the Iron Throne?
Yes.
And we begin to see that in episode 1 where he has that wound on his back.
Yep.
In episode 2 that we're about to talk about, he cuts his finger, and to the point where it's just a little nick, but then they need to have maggots eat the dead flesh. So something's going on.
So this is, I'm glad you brought this up, because I can't believe it's not in my notes, but it is.
You can't believe it's not in your notes, but it is?
I can't believe it's not in my notes, but it is. Oh yeah, it is. Okay. It was just taking me a second.
That was just a very confusing sentence.
It was. Good thing it's recorded for everybody to listen to. Yeah, so there's this idea in A Song of Ice and Fire in this world that the Iron Throne will cut a king if he's unworthy or if he acts unkingly. And so famously, the Mad King, who you mentioned at the top of the podcast, one of his nicknames toward the end of his reign was King Scab, because he was always cutting himself on the Iron Throne. There is lore about how one of the more cruel kings, Maegor, was killed by the Iron Throne, actually. And, some of that's kind of like an in-universe joke. Well, he was probably more likely assassinated because he was such an asshole. In this show, yeah, we start off with the King Viserys being treated by some of his maesters, and there's another plot line here that I want to come back to, and there's kind of a mystery ailment that's bothering him. It looks like an infection that won't clear up. It's on his back. We don't get a confirmation that it's from a cut given to him by the throne, but then at the very end of the episode,
we can assume.
It makes sense that it would be. And then it's at the end of this episode when he is banishing Daemon and disinheriting him that he cuts his finger on the throne, and that's the first time we see him cut himself. And then we see in episode 2 that it has not cleared up. In fact, it's gotten worse. And you mentioned the maggots. But the thing I wanted to talk about was you saw a little bit of conflict between the masters who were treating him, where one of them said that
Maester?
It's Maester. It's Maester. So if anybody gets a sense we might be a little distracted, the Red Wings are currently playing for a spot in the playoffs. And I can see it in Sean's reflection. I also just got can you please be quiet, because the baby's struggling to sleep. Okay. So the idea in the scene with the first scene where he's being treated is one of them says, well, let's use leeches. and the other one disagrees. He said, no, we should cauterize it to stop the spread. And you get a sense that there is either some incompetence on the part of the Grandmeister, or maybe a little bit of intentional ill treatment. And this connects to an idea that exists in the fandom based partially on things from the Song of Ice and Fire series, and then I think also some more from the Fire and Blood series, that basically the Meisters don't like magic, and they try to extinguish magic as best they can. And one of the things that they did to remove magic from the world is kill the dragons. And so there might be a conspiracy to weaken the dragons, kill the dragons, and part of that could be kind of undermining House Targaryen. Anyway, so that's a small thing. We'll see if that happens, especially in season 2. They might return to this, but definitely the physical degradation of Viserys is one of the things that I like the most about season 1, even though it's totally gross.
Yeah, towards the end, he reminds me of the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin the Fourth.
Oh yeah,
with his leprosy and like the mask and all of that stuff. Yeah, except wherein Viserys is probably like in his 60s. Baldwin was like 25 when he died or something.
Yeah, he was. He was very young.
Yeah.
I was just going through my notes here. The character of Daemon, obviously we've mentioned him a couple times now. He is the king's younger brother. He's disinherited at the end of the first episode. We also have a couple scenes with him. Some talk about brutality. I mean, we have the tourney scene with just people getting straight up butchered in the arena, and then we also have the gold cloaks scene where they're going out and chopping off hands and chopping off genitals and chopping off heads. And there's a scene with a cart with a bunch of limbs just being wheeled out of the city, and Daemon is the one who's chopping off all these parts.
Yeah, like I said, violence just is pivotal to this series. And I think it set I don't want to say good example, but it really helps paint the picture of who Daemon is.
Yes.
With the violence, and begins to make you a little uneasy about him as a character.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I didn't like Matt Smith as Daemon.
You didn't, or you don't?
I did not, because I keep thinking of him as the Doctor.
Oh, yeah. See, I've never watched Doctor Who, so I don't have that issue.
Yeah. So then, like, I see him in this, and I'm like, oh my God.
So I think he does a good job with the performance. He has
towards the end of the series, I was like, okay, I'm coming around to this, and I can see it, but it took me a while.
So, I mean, in this episode, we have him brutally enforcing the laws of King's Landing. Personally, we have him jousting like a dick in the tournament where he unhorses somebody dishonorably, and then after he is unhorsed, he attacks Kristen Cole, and Kristen Cole defeats him, but he couldn't just be unhorsed and live with it. But we also have him being nice, if not maybe a little creepy, with Rhaenyra and the necklace. Mm-hmm. And we have him in a very vulnerable moment. We have him struggling with impotence with his lover, Mysaria. And so Daemon, and I think George R. R. Martin is on record talking about how Daemon is one of George R. R. Martin's favorite characters because of this conflict with him. He's this brutal warrior, but he's frustrated, but he also loves his family and he's insecure. And it really just comes down to he wants his brother's approval and attention, and he doesn't know how to get it in a
healthy way.
Yeah. And so he lashes out and he does these things, but he's also very charismatic and obviously competent in many ways. Plus he's got an awesome dragon. Yeah. What did you think of the scene, the impotence scene, where Mysaria then says, I could get you a maid. I could get you a silver-haired maiden, which is very obviously like, I know you got the hots for your niece. I can get you somebody who looks like her.
I don't know if I really gathered that it had to do with impotence. For me, it was more like he was just distracted in terms of like everything going on in his life. So I didn't really take that scene as that big. I kind of just brushed right over it.
Okay. Well, I think it
I
helps.
will note the bizarre would you like me to get a silver-haired maiden or whatever it was, because that
Yeah.
definitely comes back in this first season.
Oh, yeah. No, it totally does. And I mean, the Targaryens practice incest. They mention the Queen Emma Arryn. She's half Targaryen herself. So she's first cousins with, or I don't know if it's first cousins, but she's very closely related to her husband, the King Viserys. Obviously, the Targaryens have a history of not just incest, but also polygamous incest. Okay, other notes here. We haven't talked about Otto Hightower at all, the Hand of the King.
Mm-hmm.
Couple notes I have here is that one of them is he very quickly has a report from the brothel scene where Daemon makes the toast that gets him disinherited. And I just kind of, my question was, who's Otto's spy at the brothel? And I know later in this season, Otto has a information-based relationship with Mysaria, where she is kind of becoming an underground intelligence gatherer, spy master, kind of string puller, and they establish a working relationship. And I'm wondering if it started this early. I have no confirmation of that. I don't know what the other speculation is. It could easily be anybody in that room, but it was just something that I noticed.
Or anybody who just wants money.
Could be, yeah.
And the
But
prince said something really dumb, so then you could go profit off of it.
that is true. Okay, so I have one note here. Did they cover too much ground? Which is, do you think too much happens in this episode?
No, when you were reading the summary, I was about to say that a lot happened. And no, I don't think they covered too much.
Okay.
Because at this point, it's when you look at where they end up at the end of season one, if you're going to draw out these first couple episodes, this would be a much longer season.
And the thing with Game of Thrones is that you had enough going on with all the various characters where you could afford to have a slow burn in King's Landing because stuff was happening with Jon Snow and stuff was happening with Daenerys and stuff was happening with, even in King's Landing, there were, minor action type things that were happening with, Ned and Jaime having their melee in the streets and whatnot. But with House of the Dragon, you have a smaller scope as far as the geography of it all, and you don't have a war brewing in the background quite yet. I mean, we get that in the next couple episodes, but it's also just a handful of characters that are involved. And so I think, covering more ground, moving quickly to the point where we have a major conflict is helpful for them. All right. Any other thoughts about, what do you think about the Iron Throne and the additional swords that they added around it?
No strong opinion.
No. Okay.
Looks cool.
I know it's something that they did to try to make it more like what George R. R. Martin's vision was, which is this like massive towering pile of swords, way bigger than what they had with the Iron Throne in the Game of Thrones show. I don't know if it's like one of the only things that jumped out to me on this rewatch as maybe not being as impressive as they wanted it to be, compared with some of the other sets and costumes and incredible visuals that they pulled off with the dragons. And I think like the tourney, especially the jousting whole thing was great. But I don't know, it's still just like a dark room with too many swords in the ground.
See, I guess to me, like the only thing I noticed that was different was the extra swords sticking up out of the ground.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Was the throne itself bigger?
No, that was the thing. The throne itself is the
then
same size.
To me, it's a cosmetic difference.
Yeah.
No strong opinion.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to episode 2 in season 1 of the House of the Dragon. It's titled The Rogue Prince. 6 months later, Daemon has illegally occupied Castle Dragonstone. Prince Admiral Kragas Drahar, known as the Crab Feeder, menaces the Stepstones archipelago at the Essos Triarchy's behest. The small council dismisses Rhaenyra's suggestion to show force and instead relegate her to appointing a new Kingsguard knight. Ignoring others' advice, she chooses Sir Criston Cole, the only knight with actual battle experience. Sir Otto sends his teenage daughter, Lady Alicent, to console the grieving king. She advises Viserys to discuss his kingly duty to remarry with Rhaenyra. Lord Corlys and his wife, Princess Rhaenys, propose that Viserys unite their Valyrian houses by marrying their 12-year-old daughter, Laena. Meanwhile, the small council learns that Daemon, proclaiming himself the true heir, stole a dragon egg and intends to marry his mistress, Mysaria, as a secondary spouse. Otto and a small detachment sail to Dragonstone to retrieve the egg. Rhaenyra follows on her dragon Syrax and forces Daemon to renounce his false claims and return the egg. Viserys announces his intention to wed Alicent, angering Corlys, who proposes an alliance to Daemon. That is it for episode 2. Sean, what did you think?
Just again, another shit ton of things happen.
Yeah, and a 6-month time jump.
Yeah. I guess the highlights for me for this one are Otto Hightower basically whoring out his daughter.
Yeah.
For power. And clearly she doesn't want any of it because there's the scenes of her picking her thumbs.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that, but that's shown in episode 1. And it's one of those things where it's not nearly as gross or brutal as some of the other things that we've seen, but it is this like just another use of disgust to communicate to the audience, and it's effective, and you can really see the anguish. This actress does a really good job kind of showing her, like, I don't want to do this, but I want to help my dad. I want to be, I want to be nice to the king, but I'm also friends with his daughter. It's just, you feel terrible for her.
Mm-hmm. What else? I think Rhaenyra, her scene of going to Dragonstone is powerful.
So badass.
It's impactful, especially after she just recommends going and just burning the crab feeders alive. And they all tell her no, but then she just goes and pretty much does exactly what she was wanting to do with the crab feeders, but does it with her uncle and is successful. So it's like, clearly she's a leader who gets shit done. Yeah. And then the crab feeder scene is horrifying.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Just tying victims up to like
nailing them, like, and nailing them to like posts in the
tide
plane. Yeah.
And then the crabs watching them eat these people alive it's gnarly, dude.
And yeah, very gnarly. Let's see. We talked about it in the first episode, but we get more of the king and his treatment for his infected cuts. This is the use of maggots to eat the dead flesh on his finger. I have a note here about how the show's candle budget must be gigantic because of, like, they have got all these scenes with just tons and tons and tons of candles. They're in the sept, and during the prayer scene, they've got the candles in front of them when they go in front of the dragon skulls. It's nuts.
Yeah, in front of the dragon skulls, I think there's like 75 candles just all lit at the same time. Could you imagine them, if they were real candles, just being like, all right, we got to film this. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Well, I was also imagining like just the reality of King Viserys saying to himself, I'm going to have this conversation with Rhaenyra. I should do it in front of the dragon heads. Hey, go light 100 candles. I'll be down there in 10 minutes. Let's see. The whole scene of King Viserys walking with Laena is so disturbing because I think they say that she's 12, but she looks younger, and she's like struggling to walk as fast as he is, and he's just walking at like a normal pace, and you can see like he doesn't want to be here, but like he knows it's his duty to remarry.
And she says something like, I was told I didn't have to bed you until I was 14 or something.
Yeah. Which is my note was, marry a child to save the realm. Anyway.
Which, I mean, he ends up marrying a child anyway.
I think we're supposed to.
Because Alicent, she's probably like still like a teenager.
Yeah, she's probably like 14 or 15, right? She's the same, roughly the same age as Rhaenyra, which is a change from the books. I think in the books, Alicent was older than Rhaenyra by 5 to 10 years or something like that. So it wasn't as creepy. And I think she was more of a nursemaid to him like provided more care than just kind of talking to him late at night. Anyway, I have another note here about it seems like Viserys genuinely cares what Rhaenyra thinks about him getting remarried, which is nice, but it gives you this, like, he shouldn't care about what she thinks, right? As everybody keeps telling him, you're the king, it's your duty to do this. It's like your duty to the realm. Like he shouldn't care about what Rhaenyra thinks. And it goes to show, and I think this is in maybe this episode, or it's already been said in one of these two episodes, that it's hard to be both a good king and a good person, where the king has to do things that you wouldn't, that a regular person wouldn't do.
Yeah, but he's a good person by wanting his daughter's input, and then he marries her best friend without her input. Like that, to me, that's like, you're a good person, bad king, and then you're a bad person, bad king, because you're not even marrying the right like lineage. You're marrying like someone out of greed because he's probably more lustful for Alicent than thinking about the good of the realm.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes to show, like, Viserys is a weak king. He's too sentimental in certain ways. And then he ends up, I think when it was, announced that Daemon took Dragonstone, Viserys like finally decided to do something. He's like, I'll go myself. It's like, obviously, like, okay, that's a decision and you're being brave, but that's the wrong decision. The king should not go to a confrontation with his brother. You send somebody else to do it. And you just happen to send the guy who, were it not for Rhaenyra's intervention, there probably would have been a lot of death in that scene. And it probably would have been Otto and everybody he came with getting burned alive by Caraxes. What else did you have for episode 2?
I don't know. I really wasn't. I watched it. Not a lot in episode 2 jumped out to me. It was all just very. 2 was kind of boring. Episode 1, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of action. 2 was more political, and it was more conversational. And I mean, it was fine. It progressed the story. We got, and I'll say there's things that happened in this episode that have payoff later that just didn't pay off in this episode. And they were just things that happened. So like Rhaenyra picking Sir Criston Cole.
Yeah.
Like that is just an event that happened in this episode, but there's a payoff to that later in the season.
Okay. So this is actually a really good thing. I want to pause here because that scene was an example to me of what makes this show very good, more like early Game of Thrones. And then, I don't want to get into, compare contrast with the Rings of Power, but in that scene, we simultaneously got a setup for a future payoff with the relationship between Rhaenyra and Criston Cole. We got a demonstration that Rhaenyra has her head screwed on straight to a certain extent because she picked the knight who actually has experience fighting, because that would make the most sense for protecting her father. What we also get is that she chose the less politically savvy option, right? So it's like, okay, so Rhaenyra does the thing that is practical and effective, even if politically it might not be the best. And I think, and that's something that is going to come back and haunt her. That instinct is going to come back and haunt her. And then we also get what I thought was a really cool, just visual way of engaging with the audience, where, how they had all of the knights kind of arrayed in a semicircle in that courtyard. And then Harold Westerling, the Kingsguard Lord Commander, would move those little, I want to call them chess pieces, but those figurines into a smaller pedestal, and that would signify like calling forward the knight that corresponds. And did you notice how each of those pieces was carved to match the heraldry of the knight? And Criston Cole's was just like a cylinder with like a little design drawn into it because he's not a noble. He's baseborn. I thought that was just a really cool visual thing to display. So even that scene, which doesn't, not a whole lot happens, they still pack a lot in there, which I appreciate. And because it makes even this episode is really setting up conflicts, right? We need to end with Corlys and Daemon forging an alliance to go fight the crab feeder. we need to get Alicent hooked up with the king. We need to see what that does to Rhaenyra and start a rift there. All of that needs to happen, but the way that we get there was so enjoyable that it was kind of boring, but also, still a good episode.
Yeah, I never lost interest in this episode.
Yes.
But I wasn't as enthralled as I was with the first episode, with the action and all of that. But I'm the same way. Like, if you ask me my Lord of the Rings movies, I used to say Fellowship was my least favorite because it was the least action compared to 2 and 3. But as I've grown, Sam, now Fellowship is probably my number 2.
Okay.
Two Towers is now my least favorite of the 3.
Interesting. All right. I think that's tough. That's like picking between 3 of my children, even though I only have one.
What do you want to talk about with this episode? Because I'm tapped out. I'm happy to offer my opinion on.
There's a line here. I think this is what King Viserys says to Rhaenyra when they're having dinner. I don't remember exactly where it was, but the quote is a mother's absence is like a wound that will never heal, which is funny because he has a bunch of wounds that won't heal and his daughter doesn't have a mom. So Mysaria, I felt like her accent was moving around a little bit. It seemed to shift during the course of her conversation with Daemon. And then she talks about how she long ago took steps to ensure that she would never have never be burdened by childbirth, which, I don't know if that means something magical or something surgical or just like a decision she made about never having children. But then she says she's looking for liberation from fear. And I was like, what is she, FDR? What is this? Oh, I love
for our non-American listeners, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
4 freedoms. The miniature city that King Viserys has is so cool.
That he has commissioned. And it's of Old Valyria, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So he reads textbooks and then basically describes what the architecture should look like, and then he has people go and make it for him, which is pretty interesting.
Okay, so like I said, we haven't talked a ton about Otto Hightower, but they really kind of play him up to be a lot like Tywin Lannister. You have this kind of cold and calculating figure. This is something that didn't really make a ton into the show, but in the books, Tywin really wanted Cersei to marry Prince Rhaegar, who ended up getting with Lyanna Stark, because he wanted to tie his family in with the royal family. And so you kind of get a sense of that. Like Otto is
manipulating
things. Oh, and also both Tywin and Otto are widowers. So there's some obvious parallels, and then just kind of the way that they're operating as well. I really like Otto Hightower. In fact, I like a lot of the counselors that they have on the show, especially Lord Strong. I think it's Lionel Strong, who is I think right now he's the Justiciar, the Lord of Laws or whatever. Later he'll become Hand of the King. He gets really good advice about the whole remarrying thing to Viserys. And it seems like what we didn't get was whoever was telling Viserys to marry Alicent. Because all of the advice was marry Laena. And then he says, I'm going to marry Alicent Hightower. So it was Otto, but what was he saying? What was the pitch?
But I don't think anybody was saying anything. I think
you think that was all sentiment?
I think it was all manipulation, where Otto knew the mental state of the king and strategically placed his daughter at moments to be beneficial. So when the king had that moment of, do I want to marry for political reasons, or if I'm going to remarry, I'm going to choose who I want to remarry. I think it was all fabricated by Otto. I don't like him.
Yeah.
The show does a really good job, and I think the actor too does a really good job of making you dislike him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's a scumbag personally, and I don't care for him at all. Even throughout the entire season, he's a character that I would like to die.
Okay, you might have to wait a little while for that to happen.
Yeah, that's okay though. I'm patient.
Yeah, I don't know if I like him. I think I respect him as an operator.
It's the same thing with Littlefinger. To me, he's a combination of Tywin Lannister and Littlefinger.
Ooh.
He's getting these rumors and things from spies. He's a sleazebag. He's politically manipulative.
I think Littlefinger is like an echelon. He's like a layer worse than Otto Hightower. The thing is, so here I would never.
But I'm saying
Littlefinger would never put himself in mortal danger to serve his king, like Otto did when he led that group to go retrieve the dragon egg from Daemon. Like Otto.
That's why he's a combination of the two. He's not.
Okay.
He's not all Littlefinger.
Well, I don't think Tywin would do that either. Yeah, I think Tywin.
He's his own being, man.
I'm just saying he might be a little bit more. He might have a little bit more moral courage than Tywin, even if they're very similar in other ways. All right, I think we've probably squeezed out most of what we're going to get from episode 2. Maybe one final thing here. At one point, they're talking about like what to do with Daemon, and Viserys says, "Oh, I can't send him to the wall." I was like, actually, that would be the perfect place to send him. Like, send him to the wall. He was the commander of the Gold Cloaks. He could be the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he'd be out of your hands.
And he'd do a pretty good job at it, too.
He'd probably do a pretty good job.
He took pretty good command of those 2,000 troops.
Okay. All right, folks. So this was episode 73 of Els Rings Nerdy Things, talking about the first 2 episodes of House of the Dragon Season 1. Join us next week for episodes 3 and 4 of House of the Dragon as we prepare for the Season 2 premiere, which I think is mid-June. We will cover that week by week, episode by episode, and we hope you will join us for it. So have a good night, and let's go Red Wings.
Send us a Facebook Messenger
message
if you would like a Els Rings Nerdy Things sticker. Bye, everybody.